So, how does caffeine work? I'm glad you asked. Basically, caffeine binds to the adenosine receptors. Dopamine indirect clock binding of adenosine neurotransmitters. I just read like 20 pages of bullshit and none of it made any sense. Let's make this easier. Now, let's say this is your brain. In general, he doesn't really enjoy going to work, doing math homework, doing the dishes. But in contrast, if you were to give your brain 6 hours of TikTok, Netflix, and hot Cheetos, he'd probably be fine all day. The reason being is that calculus and his dead-end job as a Target cashier don't provide dopamine, but TikTok and hot Cheetos do. Dopamine being basically what is the happy chemical in the brain. It affects a bunch of super important things like pleasure, motivation, and alertness. It's what our brain gives us when we do something that it likes, like listening to your favorite bands, spending time with your friends, and for a lot of us, playing video games. When you do an activity that doesn't provide dopamine, your brain sets an expectation for future attempts at that activity. It says, well, that sucked. That didn't give me any dopamine. So the next time that you need to do it, it tells your conscious brain, that sucked and it was boring. But in reality, things aren't boring just because. They're boring because they didn't provide dopamine. Now, you might say, what does coffee, caffeine, and energy drinks have anything to do with dopamine? Well, they're a magic liquid. They pop in and talk directly to your subconscious brain and say, don't worry, I'm going to give you dopamine for the next 6 hours. And your whiny subconscious brain that would normally be kicking and screaming about differential equations suddenly doesn't care anymore because it's being drip-fed what is essentially energizing liquid TikTok. Now you might say, okay Brian, I know why it makes me feel motivated, but why does it make me feel awake? Why does it make me feel more alive? Well, to know that answer, you have to know what adenosine is. Adenosine is the chemical in your brain that builds up the longer you're awake. It pretty much is the sleepy chemical. And while caffeine might be filling up your dopamine receptors, it's also blocking your adenosine receptors, stopping any from actually making you tired. Now, simultaneously, it doesn't actually get rid of the chemical, and when it wears off, you'll get a flood of adenosine, causing you to feel really tired. You know, it's the post-energy drink crash. But while you are under the influence, it really does hit adenosine with that. Now, those are just two of the more interesting effects of coffee and caffeine in general, but the most surprising one for me was that daily coffee drinkers have a 50% reduction in suicide rate. Now, the reason that this is thought to happen is because it kind of affects similar parts of the brain that antidepressants do. Now, if you are depressed, don't fucking take this video and start chugging 8 cups a day of coffee. That's a horrific idea. Now, continue with the 8 cups of coffee part. They did find that after about 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day, the beneficial effects had diminishing returns. So, there's a limit. Now, to wrap up the exclusively positive effects of caffeine, it can also protect against Alzheimer's, Parkinson's disease, reduces the risk of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and a few different cancers around the body. And by protects from, I do mean reduces the percentage that you contract these issues. Now, it doesn't fix anything. The negative effects of caffeine have a correlating relationship with how much you not only use it, but also how much you misuse it. A single cup of coffee can fuck up your sleep schedule for 3 days, but over those 3 days you can also get addicted, because that's literally all it takes. Now, with that addiction, the withdrawal symptoms are somewhat, I'd say mild, compared to a lot of other stuff you could take, but the symptoms include headache, anxiety, irritability, low energy, difficulty to concentrate, and even tremors. Now, it's also surprising how many different ways coffee and caffeine in general affects your breath, that coffee breath smell. Sulfur aroma compounds can form while the coffee's brewing. Tannin, something in coffee, sticks to your teeth and makes it that stained yellow. And the acidity in the coffee can also break down enamel over time. But caffeine slows down saliva production, causing more bacteria and grime to form in your teeth. Although, for the most part, a lot of these negative effects can be mitigated just by being responsible, Don't drink too much coffee, limit yourself to at most 2 cups a day. Make sure you don't drink coffee within 6 hours of going to sleep. Now that you understand the science behind why caffeine does what it does, I think it's important to talk about the history of it. Coffee was discovered in Ethiopia in the 15th century and quickly moved to the Arabian Peninsula to be farmed. By the 16th century, it was mass-produced and coffee houses formed. Coffee and coffee houses became so important in the Arabian Peninsula that cafes began to be called schools of the wise, and coffee was called the wine of Arabia. Due to the popularity, travelers quickly brought it to Europe in the 17th century. Then, it proceeded to spread like wildfire through Europe. But, Due to its origin, the East, some despised it and referred to it as the bitter invention of Satan. When the drink came to Venice in 1615, it was condemned by the local clergy. The controversy was so great that the Pope was asked to intervene. After trying it, Pope Paul V loved it so much, he gave it the papal approval. Pope Paul was also known for allowing Galileo to develop the geocentric model, a theory stating that Earth is at the center of the universe and that our solar system revolves around Earth. So in general, the Pope seemed like a pretty chill dude. As coffee quickly became the breakfast drink, replacing beer and wine, people began their day energized and focused, instead of, wasted. Another 100-ish years and a shift a few thousand miles west, we come to the Revolutionary War. After the Boston Tea Party and the boycott of British tea, coffee caught on quite well. Coffee houses were formed, and drinking coffee was seen as a patriotic act, and the drink itself became a patriotic product. Prominent figures such as John Adams and Benjamin Franklin endorsed coffee consumption. During the Civil War, Andrew Jackson substituted coffee and sugar for a soldier's daily rum and brandy rations. The modifications greatly benefited the Union soldiers. While traveling, they would not always have access to clean water for coffee, sometimes resorting to puddles, streams, and even the Mississippi River. After Lincoln blockaded the South, it also cut off the Confederate supply lines, including coffee. This was a major moral blow to the Confederates. As one Union soldier cited, "You can't do soldiering without coffee." These are just a few examples of major impacts that coffee has had in many histories throughout the world, but I went looking at the demographics of coffee, who drinks the most, and it turned out that Finland drinks more coffee than anyone else in the world per capita. And I thought, America has really riveting stories on why coffee is important to them culturally. And I Googled it, and it's just really fucking cold there, and that's literally the only reason. With over 2 billion cups of coffee consumed per day, coffee, and in turn caffeine, is the most consumed liquid besides water. It might not be the strongest stimulant in terms of effect, but it's definitely the most powerful one, historically and culturally. Of course, there's probably an hour more of thesis writing I could do about coffee, but I think this is a good ending. And if you enjoyed the video, like and subscribe.